It's 2:30 p.m. on a blistering afternoon in Barranca Bermeja, Colombia. The air is thick with diesel smoke. The streets buzz with the sound of motorbikes and street vendors, and inside a local Coca-Cola bottling plant, a man is marking the final hours of his shift. His name is Isidro Segundo Gil. He is 36 years old, a devoted husband, a father, and a union leader. He's been organizing workers for years, advocating for better pay, safer conditions, and dignity in the workplace. What he doesn't know is that this will be the last time he clocks in. By nightfall, he is dead shot multiple times inside the very plant he worked in by gunmen who entered without resistance. It wasn't random. It wasn't personal. It was a message. This wasn't just a killing. It was a declaration organizing against Coca-Cola in Colombia could cost you your life. To the outside world, Coca-Cola is happiness in a bottle. It's the smiling Santa Claus in holiday commercials, the refreshing pop at a summer BBQ, the brand whose red and white logo is more globally recognized than the cross. But behind the marketing, behind the billions of dollars and the global reach, there's a darker hidden story, a story soaked in blood, intimidation, and silence. This is not fiction. It's not speculation. It's a documented pattern of abuse, collusion, and human rights violations that stretches back decades, and it centers around the world's most iconic beverage company. To understand how Coca-Cola became entangled in the murder of union leaders, we have to begin with the system it operates in, and the countries it chooses to do business in. In the 1980s and 1990s, as globalization surged, American corporations began to offload labor to developing nations in search of lower costs, fewer regulations, and most crucially, less resistance. Colombia, long plagued by civil war, political instability, and a weak labor infrastructure, became fertile ground. For multinational companies, it was the perfect storm, a nation rich in resources and desperate for foreign investment, but too fragile to defend its workers. And so Coca-Cola didn't need to build bottling plants in these regions. It simply partnered with local companies, franchise bottlers who did the dirty work. It allowed the global brand to claim distance from abuses on the ground while maintaining the profits that flowed from their operations. By the 1990s, bottling plants affiliated with Coca-Cola operated in multiple Colombian cities. And in every single one, union organizers began reporting threats. Not just verbal abuse or layoffs, but death threats, harassment, home invasions, and then executions. According to the union Sinal-Trainal, short for the National Union of Food Industry Workers, at least 9 of its members were murdered between 1989 and 2002 in connection with Coca-Cola bottling plants in Colombia. Many others were kidnapped, tortured, or forced into exile. The most infamous case was that of Isidro Gil. On December 5, 1996, Gil was gunned down inside the Bebidas y Alimentos bottling plant in Carepa, Antioquia. Just days earlier, paramilitaries had come to the plant and posted a list of union leaders they intended to kill. Gil was on it. His name wasn't just targeted, it was pre-approved. But what happened next was perhaps even more chilling. The very next day, the paramilitary group returned not to kill, but to negotiate. With Gil now dead, they convened a meeting with all the plant workers and made their pitch: quit the union or die. Terrified and grieving, every worker complied. The union collapsed overnight. Coca-Cola's response: silence. No investigation, no condemnation, no effort to support or protect the workers. The bottler continued operations. Profits continued to flow, and union activity, it vanished until international outcry years later. By the early 2000s, activists, labor groups, and human rights organizations began drawing attention to these atrocities. The case became a symbol of everything wrong with globalization, the way corporations could reap rewards while local partners handled the cost of doing business. And in Colombia, the cost was often paid in lives. Critics accused Coca-Cola of willful negligence. Others went further, alleging outright complicity. Multiple lawsuits were filed in the United States under the Alien Tort Claims Act, a legal provision that allows foreigners to sue companies for human rights violations committed abroad. Sinal-Trainal, along with the International Labour Rights Fund, brought a case against the Coca-Cola Company and its Colombian bottlers, accusing them of knowingly using paramilitary death squads to suppress union organizing. The evidence was damning. Testimonies from survivors, documents tracing corporate relationships, a pattern of murders that always seemed to follow the same script: union gains, followed by threats, then violence. But proving a direct link between Coca-Cola's corporate headquarters in Atlanta and a hired gun in Colombia proved difficult. Coca-Cola's defense was simple: we don't own the bottling plants. It was a legal firewall. Coca-Cola claimed it had no operational control over its franchise bottlers, and therefore could not be held liable for what they did, even if those operations used Coca-Cola branding recipes and equipment. It's a clever corporate arrangement. Risk is outsourced. Labor is outsourced. And when things go wrong, death repression scandal, the company simply points to the legal paperwork and walks away. But critics argue that this is more than legal sleight of hand. It's by design. The franchise model allows Coca-Cola to dominate markets without ever dirtying its hands. And in places like Colombia, where labor leaders are routinely murdered with impunity, the cost of maintaining that distance is measured in funerals. By the early 2000s, the campaign against Coca-Cola gained traction globally. Activists launched Killer Coke, a worldwide boycott movement that spread through universities, labor unions, and human rights networks. They plastered posters with blood-dripping Coca-Cola logos, staged die-ins on campuses, and demanded that institutions cut ties with the beverage giant. Students at over 60 US universities petitioned their schools to cancel Coca-Cola contracts. Some succeeded. The University of Michigan, New York University, and Rutgers all suspended or severed their agreements with the company, citing ethical concerns. Even in Europe, the movement gained steam, with labor parties and political figures calling for investigations into Coca-Cola's practices. But Coca-Cola remained unmoved. In public statements, the company denied all wrongdoing. It claimed it abhorred violence, supported human rights, and cooperated fully with investigations, though in reality those investigations were either superficial or outsourced to consultants handpicked by the company itself. Internal reviews consistently exonerated Coca-Cola of any blame. Independent inquiries were dismissed as biased or unfounded, and in court the company fought ferociously. Years of litigation followed. The cases dragged on. Witnesses disappeared. Judges were changed. Motions were filed, thrown out, refiled. Coca-Cola's army of lawyers used every procedural tactic to avoid discovery testimony and depositions. And slowly, predictably, the public attention faded. But the workers did not forget. Behind the gates of bottling plants in towns like Barrancabermeja, Cartagena, and Bucaramanga, the memory of the murdered lingered. Shrines were built, murals painted. Families of the slain gathered each year in candlelight vigils demanding justice that never came. And for every anniversary, Coca-Cola offered nothing. The story of union repression in Colombia is not just a story about one country. It is a case study in how corporations leverage instability, conflict, and inequality to operate with near total impunity. And it is a warning because Colombia was not the only place where Coca-Cola's labor practices raised red flags. The sun rises in Guatemala City, streaking golden light across the rooftops of tin and concrete. In the dusty outskirts of town, a Coca-Cola truck unloads its signature red crates at a neighborhood convenience store. Kids chase behind it, merchants wave, and the driver smiles. Just another morning in Latin America. But not far from here, the story is different. It's a place where the name Coca-Cola evokes fear as much as familiarity. Between the early 1970s and late 1980s, Guatemala was one of the most dangerous countries in the world to be a union organizer. The nation was in the grip of civil war. State-backed death squads, paramilitary groups, and right-wing militias operated with near total impunity. It was in this climate that Coca-Cola, through its local bottler, found itself once again entangled in bloodshed. In 1976, union leader Pedro Quevedo was gunned down in front of his children. A year later, another leader, Hector Recinos, was kidnapped and murdered. Throughout that decade, the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Guatemala became infamous not just for labor disputes, but for the sheer brutality used to break them. A United Nations report later detailed cases of torture threats and systematic retaliation against labor activists at the plant. Despite this, Coca-Cola's global operations continued uninterrupted. Profits soared. Ad campaigns ran. Commercials aired touting friendship and peace. And when confronted with the violence, the company's response was chillingly familiar. We do not operate the bottling plant directly. This pattern, the outsourcing of risk and the deflection of blame, emerged again and again. In Turkey, workers at Coca-Cola's Istanbul bottling plant attempted to organize in the mid-2000s. They were met with mass firings. Over 100 workers were dismissed in a single week. Some were detained. Others were threatened. Human Rights Watch condemned the actions. Protests erupted. International labor unions called for Coca-Cola to intervene. But the company remained quiet, claiming once again that local management, not corporate headquarters, was responsible. In the Philippines, a similar tale unfolded. When union organizers at Coca-Cola's bottling plants began pushing for safer conditions and pay increases, they reported sudden surveillance intimidation and the sudden appearance of armed men near their homes. One worker described being followed for weeks by unmarked vehicles. Another had his home raided by masked men, only to later learn they were private security subcontracted through Coca-Cola's bottling partner. What these stories reveal is not coincidence, it's system. Coca-Cola's global business model hinges on the franchise bottling system. Local companies produce, bottle, and distribute Coca-Cola products under strict agreements, branding guidelines, and formulas. But critically, they are legal entities independent from Coca-Cola's headquarters in Atlanta. This structure allows the company to expand into volatile markets with minimal liability. In regions with weak rule of law, that structure can be deadly. Because bottlers operate in environments where labor rights are fragile, violence is cheap, and justice is a luxury. They can use intimidation with little fear of consequences. And if things go wrong, the parent company can deny involvement. This strategic ambiguity protects Coca-Cola from lawsuits, from boycotts, from shareholder panic. It allows the brand to remain pristine, while its bottlers enforce control, sometimes violently. This is the genius of the system. Coca-Cola's global footprint is massive, but its accountability is minimal. In many countries, local bottlers are owned by Coca-Cola FEMSA, a publicly traded Mexican company, and one of the largest Coca-Cola bottlers in the world. While Coca-Cola owns a stake in FEMSA, the arrangement still provides enough legal separation to protect the parent company. This enables Coca-Cola to maintain control over supply chains, branding, and quality without legally owning the labor force that brings the product to life. And it's not just union leaders who face consequences. Whistleblowers, whether accountants, managers, or drivers, report retaliation. In India, in the early 2000s, activists accused Coca-Cola plants of depleting groundwater and polluting local resources. Those who spoke out were harassed. Some lost their jobs. Some faced charges. Coca-Cola dismissed the allegations as politically motivated. Investigations were slow and often inconclusive, but residents near the plants in Kerala and Uttar Pradesh continued to live with contaminated water and dry wells. Back in Colombia, union leader Javier Correa, who succeeded Isidro Gil, was placed under 24-hour armed protection by the government after multiple attempts on his life. He lived in hiding, moving constantly, sleeping in safe houses. His crime? Continuing to speak about the deaths of his comrades and the role that Coca-Cola's bottlers may have played. And yet Coca-Cola continued to operate. The deaths, the threats, the lawsuits, they didn't dent sales. The company remained a fixture at Olympic Games, Super Bowl ads, and college campuses. It continued to rank high in global brand trust indexes. Its executives collected bonuses. Its stockholders cashed dividends. How? Because Coca-Cola didn't just master the supply chain, it mastered the public narrative. Every scandal was met with a coordinated PR campaign. Press releases emphasized commitment to human rights. Third-party auditors were hired to review practices. Coca-Cola issued codes of conduct, human rights pledges, sustainability reports, often full of vague language and non-binding statements. And crucially, they controlled the media. Coca-Cola is one of the largest advertisers in the world. Its advertising budget rivals the GDP of small nations. This gives it extraordinary influence over publishers, broadcasters, and platforms. Newsrooms reliant on Coca-Cola ad dollars are unlikely to run hard-hitting investigations. Journalists find their editors reluctant. Stories get buried, delayed, or spiked. And the victims, many poor, many foreign, many unnamed, are forgotten. The company's lobbying influence is also massive. In the United States, Coca-Cola has consistently ranked among the top food and beverage industry donors. It funds political campaigns, sponsors academic research, and maintains a revolving door of consultants who move between public office and corporate PR. Internationally, it does the same, navigating laws, shaping regulations, and quietly persuading governments to look the other way. In 2015, after years of boycott pressure, Coca-Cola agreed to fund a human rights impact assessment of its Colombian operations, conducted by a law firm of its choosing. The report concluded that Coca-Cola was not responsible for the violence and that its bottlers had taken adequate steps to address past issues. The company used the report to declare the matter closed, but human rights experts called the report a whitewash. Victims' families were never consulted, independent unions were excluded, and no follow-up mechanisms were put in place. Because for Coca-Cola, the real goal wasn't justice, it was plausible deniability. The question now is, how long can the deniability hold? As social media spreads and independent journalists gain ground, the stories once buried are resurfacing. Hashtags like "You're a killer Coke" trend again. Documentaries appear on YouTube. Survivors speak directly to global audiences. The old playbook, deny, delay, deflect, is less effective in a world where anyone can publish, post, and amplify truth. But for the families of the murdered, no PR campaign can erase the pain. When silence becomes unbearable, even whispers can shake the ground. And by the early 2000s, those whispers began to grow. From student unions to labor organizations, from Latin American refugee testimonies to the echo chambers of early internet activism, the voices long ignored began to form a chorus, a defiant one. It was time to confront the world's most powerful beverage company with a question it had long refused to answer: who pays the price for a Coke? The Killer Coke campaign had begun as a fringe protest. A few posters, a website run by a passionate ex-professor named Ray Rogers, and some underground zines. But soon it erupted into a global boycott movement. At first glance, it seemed impossible. How do you fight Coca-Cola, a brand with more than 100 years of pristine image-making global reach in every grocery store and gas station, and a billion-dollar marketing machine that could drown out most accusations in a sea of holiday jingles and Olympic sponsorships? The answer was, you hit them where they least expected. College campuses. Universities, long bastions of activism, were among Coca-Cola's most valuable institutional clients. Contracts worth millions of dollars gave Coke exclusive vending and dining rights across hundreds of schools in the United States, Canada, the UK, and beyond. In exchange, Coke-sponsored events gave student scholarships, funded research, and painted campuses in red. It was brilliant marketing, but also their vulnerability. Students began organizing referendums. Protesters staged die-ins outside Coke trucks. Activists gave public lectures detailing the Colombian Union killings. And crucially, they demanded that university administrations conduct independent reviews of Coca-Cola's human rights record. At Rutgers, NYU, the University of Michigan, Carleton University in Canada, and many others, student pressure forced action. Coke contracts were suspended, in some cases, cut entirely. Other campuses made continued relationships contingent upon full transparency and third-party audits. Coca-Cola responded swiftly, not by addressing the core accusations, but by launching an aggressive damage control campaign. They hired public relations firms, launched new sustainability initiatives, and rolled out glossy human rights policy statements. But behind the scenes, they were also pressuring administrators. Emails leaked from universities showed Coke executives lobbying deans and trustees to keep contracts intact. Legal threats followed, and in some cases, Coke used its charitable donations as leverage, suggesting that critical departments or diversity initiatives might lose funding if the company were removed. Still, the pressure mounted. International labor unions joined in. The AFL-CIO, SEIU, and global federations like the IUF lent their voices. They provided testimony from Colombian survivors, legal support to whistleblowers, and media contacts for journalists willing to take the risk. Suddenly, Coca-Cola wasn't facing a few angry students, it was facing an international movement. In the US court system, the Alien Tort Claims Act lawsuit filed by Sinal continued to evolve. The plaintiffs alleged that Coca-Cola and its bottlers had either collaborated with or knowingly benefited from paramilitary groups that killed, tortured, or intimidated union members. Coca-Cola deployed some of the most powerful corporate attorneys in the world. Their defense strategy rested on 4 key arguments. First, that the company did not directly own or control the bottling plants in question. Second, that the incidents occurred entirely within Colombian jurisdiction. Third, that the company had no knowledge of nor role in the violent acts. And fourth, that allowing the case to proceed would set a dangerous precedent, one where any multinational could be sued for the behavior of partners abroad. The case dragged on for years. Motions to dismiss, procedural delays, jurisdictional challenges. At one point, the court dismissed the claims against Coca-Cola itself, but allowed them to proceed against the bottlers. Eventually, even those claims were struck down. No liability, no trial, no justice. But the legal battle, win or lose, had already done something remarkable. It had pierced the armor. For the first time in its modern history, Coca-Cola was vulnerable. The public saw cracks in its carefully managed image. News outlets, once reluctant, began to ask tougher questions. Documentary filmmakers turned their cameras on the company. Le Monde, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, the BBC, all aired segments connecting Coca-Cola's business operations to labor abuses across the global south. In 2005, the independent documentary The Coca-Cola Case, directed by German Gutierrez and Carmen Garcia, premiered at film festivals. It traced the legal battle between Coca-Cola and Colombian trade unionists, combining court footage, survivor interviews, and activist testimonies. The film was banned in several countries, pulled from some streaming platforms due to legal threats. But it circulated anyway, copied, pirated, streamed on underground sites. The truth could no longer be contained. Yet for many survivors, the attention came too late. Families of the murdered received no reparations. The names of fallen union leaders were rarely spoken by company officials. Shrines erected in their honor were vandalized. In Colombia, the cycle of fear continued. Workers at bottling plants whispered warnings to new hires. Don't speak too loudly, don't organize, don't ask questions. That's how Isidro Gil died. What was Coca-Cola's response to all this? In 2008, the company released a corporate social responsibility (CSR) report boasting about its zero-tolerance policy for human rights abuses. It hired former diplomats and human rights experts to serve on advisory councils. It hosted roundtables with NGOs, but critics noted that none of the victims' families were ever invited. None of the independent unions were included, and the paramilitary networks that had terrorized labor organizers in Colombia were never investigated, let alone prosecuted. It was reform without accountability, a brand-managed facelift. In internal memos, later leaked executives referred to the activism campaign as noise management. They treated the deaths as PR crises, not moral ones. Meanwhile, the boycott efforts were quietly undermined. At universities where contracts were suspended, Coca-Cola launched lobbying efforts to be reinstated. They offered scholarships, funded sustainability labs, pitched community outreach. Over time, many campuses allowed the company back. A new generation of students unaware of the controversy saw only the familiar logo and the free merchandise. The past faded until someone brought it up again. This erasure was not accidental. Coca-Cola, like many global corporations, operates not just with lawyers and lobbyists, but with historians. It controls its own legacy. The official company timeline on its website makes no mention of Colombia, no mention of murdered union leaders, no lawsuits, no strikes, just images of smiling children, Olympic torches, and slogans about peace and unity. But history isn't marketing. And in every labor hall from Bogota to Manila, every student protest from Boston to Toronto, and every workers' meeting in a remote village where Coca-Cola's red trucks roll through, the memory persists. In the modern world, corporations are no longer just economic forces. They are storytellers, cultural architects, moral arbiters, and none more so than Coca-Cola, a brand that doesn't just sell beverages, but sells memories. First dates, family dinners, World Cups, Christmas, peace, happiness. But what if the cost of that happiness is silence? What if the true price of that cold bottle, its clinking ice and iconic curve, is the life of a man whose only crime was asking for dignity? As the dust settled from the global lawsuits, as the student protests quieted, as university contracts were renewed and documentaries faded from headlines, the Coca-Cola company emerged largely unscathed. The stock price remained strong. CEO bonuses increased. The brand survived. But for the families of murdered union leaders, nothing was over. Nothing was settled. In Colombia, Maria del Carmen, the widow of Isidro Gil, continued to raise her children in the same city where her husband was executed. She received no compensation, no apology. Her children grew up with the memory of fear in their DNA. In interviews, she described how Coca-Cola's presence in their town was both haunting and normal, like a shadow cast by a smile. She wasn't alone. Across Colombia, Guatemala, the Philippines, Turkey, and elsewhere, the pattern persisted. When labor movements emerged, they were met with not just resistance, but violence. Not always with bullets, sometimes with economic pressure firings or blacklists. But the message was the same: Coca-Cola does not negotiate with unions, it waits them out, or worse. By the 2010s, Coca-Cola had rebranded itself once again, not just as a soft drink giant, but as a champion of corporate responsibility. It sponsored climate conferences, released diversity reports, donated to health initiatives and anti-racism campaigns. It created an online museum celebrating its history, a history conspicuously devoid of violence. At the same time, it quietly ramped up lobbying efforts around the world. In the United States, Coca-Cola's political donations surged. In 2016 alone, it spent over $8 million lobbying Congress on tax policy, health regulations, and trade. In Europe, it courted the EU with greenwashing campaigns while opposing stricter sugar regulations. In Africa, it expanded aggressively into rural markets, often without clear labor protections. And in developing countries, Coca-Cola's footprint became nearly inescapable. Its trucks delivered more reliably than public services. Its advertising shaped childhood diets. Its supply chains extended deep into regions with weak governance and high inequality. In this system, resistance becomes dangerous. Journalists investigating Coca-Cola's practices often faced indirect pressure. Whistleblowers were discouraged. Lawsuits were rarely filed because few could afford to challenge a company with near-limitless legal resources. But a shift was beginning. A new generation of activists, lawyers and researchers started asking not just what Coca-Cola had done, but how it kept getting away with it. They pointed to the power imbalance in international law, the legal doctrine of corporate personhood that shields companies from moral consequence, the franchise model that diffuses accountability across continents. In academic circles, Coca-Cola became a case study in ethical laundering, how to outsource risk-buy influence and maintain an image of virtue, all while profiting from systems of oppression. The company wasn't alone. Nestlé, Nike, Shell, Amazon, all operated in similar ecosystems. But Coca-Cola was the symbol, the blueprint, the smiling face that made the system seem innocent. In 2020, a renewed global reckoning emerged. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of supply chains and the vulnerability of frontline workers. Coca-Cola laid off thousands, while executives maintained bonuses. The public began to ask harder questions about essential labor, corporate ethics, and the exploitation built into the things we consume daily. Suddenly, the old narratives no longer held. Social media became a platform for alternative histories. Survivors of labor abuse posted directly to global audiences. Student activists revived the Killer Coke campaign with new language visuals and tech-savvy strategies. Labor organizers in Colombia connected with unions in California, South Africa, and beyond. The Global South had found its voice and its echo. And in 2021, something rare happened. Coca-Cola admitted it was re-evaluating its franchise bottling models in certain regions due to reputational concerns. It was a corporate way of saying the fire is getting closer. Still, no direct apology was issued, no reparations, no monuments for the dead. So what now? If the story ended here with one of the world's most powerful brands escaping justice, rewriting its legacy, and continuing business as usual, it would be easy to feel hopeless. But that's not how stories work, not real ones. Because in every country where Coca-Cola has operated, there remain people who remember, people who resist, people who organize. In Bogotá, murals honoring fallen unionists are painted over by authorities and painted back again by students. In Istanbul, labor organizers meet in underground cafes sharing tactics and names. In Manila, social workers document wage theft. In Johannesburg, artists compose songs about capitalism and its ghosts. In Mexico, lawyers prepare new legal challenges testing new grounds of international law. And in every vending machine, every grocery shelf, every stadium, the red label sits untouched by scandal, still associated with joy. But the truth is in the cracks, in the silences, in the stories you're not supposed to know. Because in the end, this isn't just a Coca-Cola story. It's about what kind of world we want to live in. A world where brands can murder with impunity and be celebrated for diversity campaigns. Or a world where lives matter more than logos. Where human dignity outweighs corporate marketing. Where the dead are not forgotten for the sake of convenience. We cannot drink away the truth. We cannot market our way out of history. So the next time you see that familiar red, can ask yourself, what's in it? Not just sugar, not just fizz, but silence. And the cost of that silence is far too high.